and that is the head of one of those three, and all three of them are in the Louvre. You can go see them today. They're in the Sully wing. So, Zahi Hawass has asked for 5 major pieces back from Western museums, including the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Louvre, the British Museum, and 2 German museums. This is not, these heads are not among the pieces that he's asked for, but you just get a sense of the feeling of despoliation that Egyptians who are passionate about archaeology in their past feel when the subject arises.
Let's give another example of that. Number 4, please. Maybe Sharon, tell us what this shows.
So this is actually one of the objects that Zahi Hawass does want back. This is the zodiac ceiling, or that's the replica. It's that black blobby thing in the top is a black plaster cast that the Louvre sent to Egypt in the 19th century after I would say an archaeologist, an adventurer, and his agent, Jean-Jacques Saulnier, spent 21 days hacking this ceiling out of the Temple of Dendera, which is this stunning temple that stands in the middle of these marshes. The Nile used to flow right up to it. It's 2,000 years old. And it is one of the earliest recorded zodiacs that we have. So if you were to see it better, if you see it as it was actually drawn in situ before it was blasted out of there by Napoleon's scientists who came with it, you could see Scorpio and Libra. You can actually see recorded an eclipse at a certain time in about 2000, about just before the birth of Christ, essentially. So it's really an amazing piece of history, in addition to being an artifact, and it's in the Louvre today. It took 21 days for the French to hack it out of the ceiling, which is on the rooftop of the Temple of Dendera. They finally used gunpowder to blast it out, and that's how they got the thing to France.
Let me ask Jim, as a museum director, should these kinds of artifacts be returned to Egypt?
Well, first I think we have to recognize that history is untidy, and it's a complicated situation. In this case, it's not just that, and I'm looking down here because we can actually see the images here in front of us, but it's not just that that this period of time in the latter part of the 18th century, early part of the 19th century was a time in which the Europeans became interested in things ancient in Egypt, but it's also at a time in which, by virtue of the Europeans becoming interested in those things then, that the local peoples became interested as well. They had lived for centuries then amongst these things, but of course they reasonably believed that the values of their civilization, call it, began with the Prophet, with Prophet Muhammad, and that these pagan artifacts had no relationship to the life they lived or the civilization that they claimed for themselves. So it wasn't, this was something that was prized and as glory of the ancient, of the current Egyptians when the French and the British were there. It was something that came upon later, and in fact the first, as it were, local history of ancient Egypt was written by an Egyptian who had studied in France and got caught up in the kind of fervor of nationalism in Paris and sweeping Europe in the middle part of the 19th century. So it is not, history is never so neat and tidy as we would like it to be, and these questions of restitution are also questions about how and on what terms might we rewrite history. They're based on the premise that there's a way to correct the imbalances, historical imbalances of power. We want to redress them in some way now. So I don't think there's a claim for these objects from, and using them generally speaking, that were removed prior to their laws being against their removal. In other words, we can now go back and say this is 180 years before Egypt passed such a law, so there's no legal reason why they might be returned.
Is there a moral reason?
That's the question. Is there a moral reason? On what terms might there be a moral reason? Might it be there's a moral reason because there's some claim that the modern state of Egypt has on the remains of an ancient civilization from which they have long been divorced, to which they have no other contact than physical proximity, and only more or less physical proximity, because the Egyptian empire, of course, will spread much greater than the current Egyptian state. I think the complication, and it's raised in the question asked of this symposium, do these things belong to the civilizations that create them? First of all, there's the big debate and question whether civilizations create anything, or whether it's people who create things and then we put them together in the framework we call civilizations. But whether you can map a civilization to the confines of a current state. And I think that those are unequal political realities. Civilization is not political in those terms that we're talking about. The state is political, and they don't even share the same geographic, same boundaries, geographic boundaries. So I don't see there as a claim. I think the only way these things can be returned is because it's to the advantage of the current possessor of these. In other words, when the Parthenon marbles and Christopher is written powerfully on it, will they be returned to Athens? Only, I think, if the British government thinks it's in its own best interest to do so. I don't think it's going to be on moral grounds. It's not going to be on historical or scientific grounds. I think it's a matter of public and political diplomacy. And
so what you're saying is that the British then, if it's in their interest, they should return the marbles because they happen to have them?
No. I'm saying they will do so only when it is in their interest. I'm not saying should they do so. I'm just saying that's the political reality of the situation. There isn't a legal claim on them, as there's no legal claim on this that can be decided. It can only be because the current possessor, thinks it's in their best interest to do so.
Well, but not to usurp your function, Mr. Chairman.
Please,
the question I was hoping you would ask was, would there be such a thing as aesthetic grounds? If we're discussing art, I think the aesthetic should have a role in it. And the case in the instance of the Parthenon, the sculpture of the Parthenon, is precisely that. The committee that I'm a member of in London used to be called the Committee for the Restitution of the Parthenon marbles. It's now called the Committee for the Reunification of them, and I'd just like to say, if I can, a few words about how that nuance matters. I mean, the sculpture of Phidias that adorns this magnificent building, or used to adorn it, is carved as a unity. It tells a story. It's partly derived from the Parthenite procession. There are all kinds of interpretations about how many numbers of human figures there are in it, and whether they are the equivalent of the Greek casualties at a certain famous battle, and so forth. But at any rate, it doesn't make much sense to have one half of them in Athens and one half in London. You can't move the whole of the Parthenon to London, to Bloomsbury. But if, for example, during the Napoleonic Wars, the panel of the Mona Lisa had been, as did happen to quite a lot of artifacts, annexed, plundered, and then sawn in half by somebody, and we knew that one half of it was in a gallery in Stockholm and another in a gallery in Lisbon, I'm pretty sure there would be a mass movement of aesthetic curiosity to see what the two halves would look like if they were put together. And probably a strong guess could be made they'd look better than they do. Well, I think the same could be said, actually has to be said, of the Parthenon sculpture. Now, there are not very many examples of that. Sharon's just given you, and particularly vivid and beautiful, and if I may say so, very beautifully illustrated. It seems to be perfectly clear that the Louvre ought to say it's a matter of aesthetic wholeness and integrity.
Can I disagree with you on those things? I do think the Mona Lisa example is not appropriate in a situation, or not relevant, because the assumption is that you would have the entire thing and it would be split in two parts and it would come back together as the entire thing. And if that were the case, likely it would be resolved in those terms, and the two museums would share them. That would be it happens many times. In this case, and in the case of the Parthenon marbles, the Parthenon marbles, as you know very well, would not be restored in their entirety. There would be fragments of them restored, and there would be great gaps and holes.
If we have slide 30, please.
And so there, and that's the first question, it's not going to be restoring the integrity of the Parthenon itself or of its sculptured program. But secondly, there's been no suggestion, and it would be very difficult to do this, to share the entirety between Athens and London. And it's not just London, after all. You know, London's got the largest bits of the Parthenon marbles outside of Athens, but they're also in other places in Europe and so forth. So it's not quite as easy as the Mona Lisa.
Most of the smaller holders have given or are giving them back.
Exactly.
Because of the Acropolis Museum. You're quite right in saying that they can't be put back on the building, and that also some of them will be lost. The entire thing can't be restored. But you will be able very soon to see the whole of the sculpture of Phidias in one place, or you would be if the British government would, in a gallery that overlooks
that looks at the Parthenon.
Yeah. So it's the nearest you'll be able to get to a restitution. So can I just make a related point, which is about the rights of the, shall we call them for now, the indigenous, if that doesn't sound too colonial. I mean, the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt was a classical Orientalist expedition, but it was not just for pillage, it was for enlightenment, for anthropology. He attached to his fleet and his army a huge number of scholars, map makers,